Chapter 13 of my book, The Town of East Avingstone, found on conservativecornerstones.com. Chapter 13, A Castle with Spices. It is the 1500s, and a father and a son, spice merchants, are traveling to a lonely castle where they may purchase some spices for the town they live in, East Avingstone. It ought to be somewhere close by, father spoke to Ellison. Ellison, with detachable hood pulled up close around his face, started glancing about, trying to remember the descriptions that had been given to them. The light of the setting sun scattered several rays over the dusty road. It had been very windy throughout the day, and the dust was clinging to their faces and had stung their eyes countless times. In the last hour, the wind had slowly died down as they traversed a slowly descending path. "'Tis a tall, thin stone building," said father. That was the only guide that was given us. The two of them were a great many miles away from East Avingstone. They felt a great many miles from anywhere, having travelled miles along dusty roads for many days and nights, through times of sunshine and times of rain, following sometimes only small trails that twisted and wound around the countryside. It was close to 3 weeks since they had departed, and now finally they were near the merchant they had been seeking. The days of rain were the most troublesome, but as father would always remind Ellison, a true merchant travels no matter what the weather. We can at least be grateful that it is not cold. Ellison had never journeyed in winter, though he knew that father had on occasion. When it was particularly stormy, he tried to imagine what it would be like to travel day and night along the roads in the snow. Once he had asked father how he stayed warm at night time during the winter, and father had admitted that on the colder nights he would take up lodgings at an inn. In summertime, though, it was far cheaper to shelter a little way from the road in some hollow, and Ellison now was used to sleeping on the soft earth. "From the description, I think it may look like a large guard tower," continued father as he glanced at the map etched out on the piece of parchment Mr. Fletching had given him. "A small castle," said Ellison, finally mustering the energy to speak. He was worn out from the day's journey, and his throat felt dry. "Mayhap something akin to one," corrected father, "though one I don't think built by the nobility. A merchant lives thither, one wealthy enough to purchase the land and build upon it. Mayhap there is a town all its own thither. Mr. Fleming told of the stone house at the centre, and a few other buildings spread out in the small valley." "Dost thou think it was chartered by Lord Alder?" asked Ellison. "Nay, son," answered father with a laugh, "we are many miles away from Lord Alder's lands, and from all nobles that mayhap know the name of East Avingstone." "Hast thou ever travelled this far?" asked Ellison in surprise. "I have travelled further than this," said father, "but not quite in this direction along these roads. All that I see are new lands to me." As they travelled, the path began a steeper dive downward, and they quickened their descent. All in one moment, beyond some trees and hillocks, the landscape opened up a little to reveal one lone, grey-looking half-castle, a stone edifice with 2 thin spires on either side of it. The grey stone looked worn and weather-beaten, and the few ramparts at the top of the house were cracked. Ellison looked at the lonely and almost foreboding place, and wondered at their having travelled so far to reach it. His mouth almost fell open. "'Tis the place, father. It matcheth Merchant Fleming's description, and is marked on the map." Father smiled brightly with his face still covered in dust from the journey. "Aye." He paused as he took a deep breath, and turned to Ellison. "Now then, as instructed, we must be as mannerly and cautious as possible. I have ne'er met Merchant Raiden afore, and Mr. Fleming spake he is a short-tempered man. It might not prove an easy task to acquire the spices. Furthermore, he also hath no knowledge that we are coming to see him, and wherefore we mustn't tread too hard upon his hospitality." Ellison nodded from under his hood. Now that the winds had quieted down, he threw the hood back and removed it, slinging the fabric over his shoulder. Father saw more clearly the sweat-streaked dust over his face. "We should find a stream to wash in before we knock upon his door," said Father, as he took his own hood off from his head. "'Tis best he not see us looking as filthy as we are." He led their 2 horses and cart into a thicket and tied them to a tree. Then they scoured the countryside in the hope of finding a stream. As they traversed the hilly lands, they noted a few other buildings spread out, and they supposed these were also financed by the merchant. "'Tis odd that the village, if village it be, is not chartered by a noble," said Ellison. "'Tis a rare sight," said Father. "He must be a wealthy merchant to provide lands to others, if it indeed is him who hath provided it. Mayhap, though, they be vassals of another lord, and 'tis only the merchant's place that is free of feudal allegiance." They found a stream and splashed their faces, wiping off as much of the dirt as they could and wetting their hair. When they felt much refreshed, taking several drinks upstream also, they went back to the road and then up to a single twisted iron gate. Beyond this gate was the castle. Father looked up and thought the gate was a portcullis, held in place by 2 short stone pillars that jutted out from the castle. The iron gate, fixed between these pillars, barred their way from reaching the front door they could see beyond, marked with several scratches. Father took a deep breath, cupped his hand to his mouth, and cried out, "Hail, Merchant Raiden! I have come to speak with thee." A long silence followed, and Ellison half fancied he could hear the echoes of Father's call. In another moment, Father repeated himself. He waited and then called out a few more times. Ellison wondered how his father's voice was holding up, and he ventured to remark, "Shall I have a go? Should we state our business?" "Nay," said Father quietly to him. "A merchant does not spill all his tongue before he sees his seller's face. 'Tis something thou shalt learn with time. We want to be friendly, but not overzealous, to tell our errand." Father shouted again and waited. "What shall we do if no one answers?" asked Ellison. "We would simply camp in hither woods," said Father, "and try again on the morrow until someone parleys are called." Ellison was just imagining the mysterious Merchant Raiden finding their camp at night, when just at that moment 2 shutters opened up from one of the 2 stone spires above. Father and Ellison looked up to see a head pop out of the window and peer down at them. No one spoke for a moment as they tried to look at each other. "Who art thou?" the voice finally asked. "My name is Everleigh Latimer, and my party hath come to speak with Mr. Raiden about merchant trade." "Thy party?" the head asked from above. "I only see 2 of thee, unless there are more hiding elsewhere." "Nay," said Father, "there are only 2 of us, and we have travelled many miles to come hither. Our aim is to seek a valuable trade with Merchant Raiden. Art thou him?" "Only 2, repeated the voice. There was a pause before he added, "Aye, thou findest Merchant Raiden in good health. I be him." "Then prithee," said Father, "grant thy servants a boon, and let us speak to thee within thy house." "'Tis a small party for a travelling merchant," said the voice placidly. Father made no remark. "What business dost thou have with me?" asked the voice. "I do not harbour wayward travellers readily." "If it pleases thee," said Father, "thou shalt desire the private transaction to be taken up from within thy quarters. We come few in number, but mighty and fair, and I come on behalf of a town and an earl, Lord Alder, the Earl of Avingstone." There was another pause before they heard the merchant laugh and chuckle. "Whether friend or foe, vagabond or not, I be not afraid of thee. Mayhap thou sayest truth. Enter," he beckoned to them. Father and Ellison stood watching as they saw the merchant disappear within his house. In another moment, they could hear wooden gears turning and metal chains clinking. The iron-twisted bars of the portcullis slid up from within the 2 pillars, and Father and Ellison strode beyond them and up the few stone steps to the wooden door of the castle. Ellison took one look behind him as the open gate reclosed, and he wondered how easily it would prove to exit again. Father pushed on the wooden door, but it refused to move and must have been bolted. They only had to wait on the landing for a moment before they heard footsteps approaching from beyond the door. A moment after that, the door swung wide open to them. "Greetings, Merchant Latimer," said the voice. "I am Merchant Raiden, and welcome thee into mine abode." For the first time, Father and Ellison could fully see the merchant. His features looked gruff, but he spoke in a straight and gentle manner. His doublet looked unworn, though the dust on it showed he had recently been out. A straight sword was sheathed and hung from a leather belt, trimmed with green satin. His leather boots stretched high, close to his knees, and looked strange to the Latimers. "Come inside, the both of thee," beckoned Raiden as he bade them enter. "We thank thy kindness," said Father. The inside of the castle did not look as rugged as the outside. Ellison thought it a pleasant and almost extravagant place, though it could not compare to the large castle of Lord Alders that the other Latimers had toured unbeknown to him. The merchant's footsteps sounded loudly down the stone hall, his boots hitting firmly with every step. Father and Ellison followed down a long hall with a few paintings and tapestries on either side. Soon, the merchant had led them into a small dining quarter that had some bacon, bread, and cheese on the tabletop. It was a simple room with hardwood furniture, but the cutlery was of the finest, with pewter and delicate bone carvings and porcelain. There was also an iron kettle with something steaming and giving the most delicious aroma Ellison had ever smelt. He did not know it, but the aroma came from steeping tea leaves inside the cauldron. Father knew that the merchant must have made a journey distant and rare to acquire them. "Help thyselves to that upon my table," said Mr. Raiden. "Thou and thy lad must have journeyed long to see me, for the names thou dost mention I have ne'er heard afore. Earl who? Aving what? I have taken many a long journey, but have not crossed paths with the lands from whence thou hailest." Father and Ellison sat down at the table between two lamps. Two narrow windows shed light from high above, though the room was still dim, and the yellow light of the lamps flickered throughout the room. Ellison eyed the food, but Father made no movement toward it. "East Avingstone lies nearly 3 weeks' journey south of southwest," said Father. "We thank thee for inviting us in. I am a merchant, as I hear thyself to likewise be. The business I have come to discuss was brought to me by Mr. Fleming." Merchant Raiden's eyes looked half surprised for a moment. "Aye," he said as he sat down opposite the Latimers and began cutting the bread and cheese. "I know Mr. Fleming a little." He said no more, but worked with his knife, and soon had placed servings of bacon, bread, and cheese into a few pewter dishes. Ellison thought that the meal far too simple for the serving trays and room the victuals sat in, but his stomach was hungry for anything, and didn't mind if the meal was unpretentious. Mr. Raiden must have read Ellison's thoughts through his expression. He smiled. "I have a more lavish cellar of victuals, but I do not often dine excessively alone. Not oft are there no special guests in mine abode, and when my trade life doesn't take me elsewhere, there are usually guests in the house. Thou hast found me in rare occasion to be by myself this evening." For several minutes no more remarks were made. Father and Ellison found the bread soft, warm, and fresh, and the cheese was nice and strong. The bacon was juicy. Simple though it was, Ellison thought he had not tasted anything better, his hunger having been sharpened by the journey. "Fleming," Mr. Raiden eventually repeated. "He saw me last mayhap 1 or 2 months erstwhile." "He and I met afore I began this journey," said Father. He hadn't wanted to rush the business, but thought that now he could reveal a little more about their errand. "Forgive my slow introduction. I am a spice merchant for East Avingstone, and the Earl that has graciously chartered our town, Lord Alder." Mr. Raiden slowly nodded and sat back in his chair. "Ah," he said as he exhaled slowly. His fingers haphazardly fiddled with his sword hilt as he smiled. "Then what is thine errand? It would appear that Mr. Fleming hath sent thee hither for to purchase my spices. I always thought him a greedy soul from the few times I had occasion to cross paths with him." Father was quick to interject. "Allow my speech to be forthright. Mr. Fleming is not financing this journey a single penny. I come on mine own accord and on behalf of our town and earl, regardless of who hath mentioned thee to me, or who shall attain a share in the profits. And I come bringing mine own coinage. But first, upon thy leave, I would like to know more about these spices thou hast, of what sort they are, and how much thou hast that thou might be willing to sell for a handsome sum." "I did not think thee a peasant," said Mr. Raydon, "and would like to see thy coinage in time." Ellison thought there was something of a greedy look that came into Raydon's eyes, and he thought again of the impassable portcullis outside. Father's eyes glanced casually about the room before settling back to the food. "I have many spices," said Mr. Raydon. "Pepper, cinnamon, cloves, nutmeg, spikenard, galangal, to name a few, and—" Here Raydon leaned forward slightly and smiled as he looked at them. "Even saffron." "Saffron?" Ellison spoke in wonderment, talking for the first time. "'Tis worth more than gold." "Forsooth, the lad can speak after all," said Mr. Raydon with a laugh. "Aye, thou sayest truth. There are several chests of pepper, and several chests of the combined others. Thou doubtless may understand that it would have to be a very large sum to encourage me to sell." "We are in thy debt, and are willing to give thee more than thy goods are worth," said Father confidently. "And so thou shalt," said Mr. Raydon. Ellison thought the comment rather rude, even though it was said in a straightforward and not unpleasant voice. He looked again toward Raydon's sword hilt, and was uncomfortable by the merchant's constantly fiddling with it. "'Tis a treasure trove of goods," said Father. "Prithee, before we babble further about the specific agreement, mayhap thou canst open up one of thy chests, and I one of my money bags." "I always prefer to settle the agreement first," said Merchant Raydon. He stood up and walked over to where a large wooden jug sat on a long, thin table. He poured a drink from it into 3 wooden cups and handed 2 over to them. "Thou canst have something else if thou desirest." "Nay, this shall do," said Father, "and we thank thy service. If thou wish more particulars first, we may turn toward settlement. Mayhap thou shalt name a price, and we shall attempt our best to match it." "My price is £300, said Mr. Raydon in a confident and free voice. Father laughed good-naturedly, almost coughing over the price as he took a drink from his cup. "That is an outrageous price for any quantity or variety of spices. Thou must name another." Merchant Raydon must have thought the comment insulting. His face turned sober, and he flushed. "Mayhap thou hast traded with earls, dukes, knights, and kings as I have. The spices I hold are worth much, and the price I give is the price I deem worthy. If thou desirest to walk away with any spices, thou shalt try thy best to oblige." Father realized the sudden soberness, and he nodded his head to show his sincerity. "I carry much coinage with me, but I can only give thee £80. "Thou art a man of small trade and penny haggling," said Mr. Raydon with a laugh. "That is an insult to my price." Father laughed in spite of the offense given him. "Pardon my small sum, but mayhap it might be raised, if thou wert to tell me what to raise it to." "I have given thee a price already," said Raydon. "Come, come," said Father reasonably. "Perchance thou might be appeased with 150. "With that I shall see thee 2 merchants to the door," said Mr. Raydon, as he stood from the table quite suddenly. "Ne'er so fast, said Father in an appeasing tone. "I did not mean to cause offence to thee, or insult thee. Thou must remember we have travelled many miles, and have fought through many a sleepless night to find thy company hither. When I spake, 'twas on behalf of our town and earl. Both them and mine own profits must be obliged. Being a merchant thyself, thou assuredly understands the financial demands of the trade. I do not often make trades of this size as a result." Ellison wondered if all trading went this way. He had only seen the process done a few times. Or if Mr. Raydon was being particularly difficult. He watched as the merchant hesitated, and hesitantly sat down again. He seemed pleased with father's latest speech. "What about £275? asked Mr. Raydon. "'Tis still outrageously high," said father honestly, "but gramercy to thy gracious course of direction. How much saffron dost thou own? Mayhap I could learn more about my purchase before we reason this agreement further." "The saffron is in a single chest," said Mr. Raydon, "about so high and so wide." He measured with his hands. "Perchance I could learn the closer value of the coinage thou art willing to spend." It was here that Ellison finally began to lose interest in the conversation. He had journeyed long, and the food and drink, which was a milky and creamy drink, had made him wish it was time for sleep. Both voices continued to drone on in his mind as his eyes gazed into the yellow flickering light of the lamps. In another minute he felt himself falling asleep, his muscles jerking back to alertness now and then. What fully woke Ellison up was a change of tone in the conversation. Mr. Raydon was speaking roughly. Ellison, fully alert now, began again to catch the words. "'Tis still offensively low," said Mr. Raydon. "Come, come," said father softly. "There must be some sort of settlement we can attain. Will thou do nothing to attempt to meet my parley? £200 is the highest I can pay." Merchant Raydon smiled and then laughed harshly. He went on laughing another moment and pounded his fist upon the table. Ellison thought the behavior rude and strange, and one look at father revealed he thought no different. "Mr. Latimer, thou hast been unwise in thy bargaining," said Raydon. Within a blink of Ellison's eyes, Raydon had drawn his sword and leapt out of his chair. It wasn't until that moment Ellison realized there was only one way in and out of the room, and now Raydon blocked the one exiting hall. Ellison drew his sword and stood up from his chair in surprised shock, heart pounding and not knowing what to do. Father sat in his chair unmoved, not even placing his fingers upon the hilt of his own sword. "Please sit thyself down, Ellison," father instructed calmly, "and let us ask our host why he hath so rudely interrupted our discourse." Ellison was surprised at father's calmness, but managed to sit back into his chair, adrenaline still pumping and hands quivering. He placed his sword on his lap and sat on his hands to warm them up and hide his nervousness. Mr. Raydon now looked grave and spoke quietly and low. "Thou art to know better than to come within thy cellar's fortress for to bargain thy price. Thou hast revealed that thou hast £200 within thy possession. I do not know the lands whence thou hailest, nor do I care for the earl or town thou knowest. Thou shalt give me thy coinage, and then be pleased to leave mine abode at once." "Thou speakest as a simpleton," said father. "I had not thought thee this unworthy." Mr. Raven gave a short laugh before turning grave again. "Thou shalt not speak ill of me again. Now, be pleased to send the lad for to fetch the coinage, and if he be not back within a few minutes, thou shalt perish. Not many find the safer end of my sword in combat." "Thou shalt remain seated," said father to Ellison. He looked back at Raydon with eyes of purpose and intent. "Thou shalt not take a step closer, or I shall draw my sword, and I warn thee that I too am not easily bested in contest with sword. Thou findest me in a humble procession for this journey, but ordinarily I travel with troops of soldiers, and have learnt my skills from the finest." "Thou durst to question," began Merchant Raydon, but father continued speaking. "Thou hast shown thyself unworthy of trade, and dishonourable in conduct. thy manners are found wanting." Father seemed placid and undisturbed, though Ellison could see the slight movement of his hand toward his own sword hilt underneath the table. He continued to speak softly. "There be no need for anger or hastiness. 'Tis only a matter of fare. Thou wishest to see the coins, and I desire to see the spices. Cannot the matter be thus resolved?" Mr. Raiden must have been surprised at Father's unmoved manner. He leaned toward the table, but made certain not to step closer. "Thou shalt have neither my spices nor any more my victuals, but I shall have thy money, and that in haste, and then thou and thy lad shall be on thy way." "Mayhap I entered this house too hastily," said Father. "Pardon any intrusion. I must warn thee that I do plan to leave with my coinage if I cannot have the spices in return, and I am willing to put my words to the test of hilt and sword if necessary. We shall leave this house, the boy and myself, and we shall take that which we brought with us. Neither thou nor thy sword shall halt our proceedings." He added quickly, "Forsooth, 'tis mine understanding that sword fights normally end in vain destruction, something I do not easily desire." "Ha!" said Merchant Raiden. "Thy skill I shall have to see, for not many have bested me in contest afore." Raiden did not spring at them, but rather came at them slowly, almost stealthily, with eyes full of purpose that made Ellison step backward. At Raiden's first step, Father had stood from the table and drawn his sword, his hands having grasped its hilt some time before, and beckoned to Ellison at his side. He knew that further discourse was useless, and halted all attempts at diplomacy. His sword was in ready position as he and Raiden approached and began to circle around each other, Ellison keeping at Father's side and brandishing his sword in both hands. "Ellison, unstake the horses and begin journeying down the road," said Father calmly and clearly. He looked entirely in control of himself and their plight as his eyes locked with his opponent's. "Wait for me at the last cross-section away from this valley, and if I do not return to thee alone, then fly with all speed to the nearest town, and there receive whatever help thou canst acquire." It wasn't until then that Ellison realized the passage to the hallway was now open, but only slightly. Mr. Raiden was focused on Father, keeping him in a pinned position away from the hall. Neither of their blades had yet met, and Ellison could see that each was weighing the strategy and skill of the other. However, Ellison was not so pinned or scrutinized, and he could stride away from both forms and reach the hall freely. His legs were reluctant to start, though, and he thought of Father fighting alone in the room with the foe that stood before them. "Shalt thou need my help?" he asked. His throat felt dry, and he was breathing heavily. "Flee!" shouted Father, as all in one moment his sword locked with his enemy's, and the contest began. Father was the first to strike, intending to throw his enemy off guard. The sharp edge of his sword made contact with the flat of Raiden's blade, making a clatter as the swords rang together through the room and reverberated off of the stone walls. The noise seemed to shake the very foundation of the stone floor they stood upon. Merchant Raiden took 2 steps backward, and then planted one of his feet firmly behind him and seemed rooted in place. The 2 swords swiveled around in a circle and came back together, metal ringing against metal as both merchants made the next move together. It was now hammer and tongs, swords clashing wildly and too quickly for Ellison to see. He fled the room with haste, and a cry upon his lips as he entered the hall. More shouts and clashes sounded from the dining room as the next several blows came out in quick succession. Ellison had to push the scene away from his mind, rending his thoughts and feelings as he rushed toward the familiar way to the door. The old wooden door was found unlocked, and Ellison swung it inward to reveal the onset of night. A flood of pale moonlight covered the grass. The sun must have only recently disappeared, for there was the faintest remnant of grey in the sky. However, the stars were becoming more visible. For a moment, Ellison froze. He looked at the foreboding portcullis, fastened closed, and then back toward the hallway. His thoughts were still on the fight that his ears could still faintly hear. With tears in his eyes, he flung the door closed, shutting out all interior sounds and awakening his ears to the nocturnal insects in the quiet of night. Ellison rushed toward the portcullis, managing to sheathe his sword just before he leapt upon the iron spokes. Pressing his feet outward on the bars, he slithered upward, hand over hand, gripping the iron. He didn't have time to think of his route upward, nor of the distance below. In another moment, he reached the top and swung over to the other side. The journey downward was painful, but quick as he slid down the iron spokes. When he reached the bottom, he was glad to realize he had used his sleeves to help pad the descent, though he was certain his hands were still scratched. He refused to check them, running full speed to where he remembered the horses were staked. A tear now rolled down his cheek, and the only feeling that kept entering his heart was one of cowardice, to flee the scene of battle. He wanted to return, but dared not. His heart was pounding, his knees felt weak, and 1,000 thoughts now began racing through his mind. Ellison collapsed into the grass in the shadows of the trees, listening to a distant owl hooting. He realized he could not force himself to take one more step away from the castle. Something in his heart and mind barred the way. Slowly, with several lungfuls of fresh air, he began to sift his thoughts and reason. The coinage is still ours, but I dursn't reach home without father, he spoke softly to himself, finding an audible voice, even his own, a comfort at the moment. I dursn't go back within the castle either, but I must. I shall have to. I cannot. Nay, I can, and I shall. The contest mayhap already be decided. I dursn't waste another moment. He stood up and ran back toward the castle in the moonlight. Now that his adrenaline had ebbed a little, he began to consider the climb and found he could not repeat it the same way twice. Instead, he wedged himself between one of the stone pillars and the iron spokes and used small cracks and crevices in the stone for handholds and footholds. A man of full girth would not have been able to use so small hands, but Ellison managed to wedge himself slowly upward until he came upon a thick rope, one used to pull the portcullis upward. He gripped the rope and used it to aid his climb, until he was at the top of the portcullis and on a thin strip of ramparts. These he followed around until they came to a small window. Narrow though it was, he could just fit in if he turned sideways. Next moment, Ellison was blinking as he tried to peer into the dark room, now only lit with dim moonlight. He felt with his hands and noticed several large wooden spokes and wheels. They must have been the gearworks of the portcullis. Then he came across some more coiled rope, and in a spur-of-the-moment decision, he picked up one of the coils and slung it over his shoulder. Then his ears strained to listen as he stepped out of the room and found a stairway leading downward. The town of East Avingstone. If thou desirest to purchase it thyself, thou canst do so on my website, conservativecornerstones.com.